It began on a snowy Christmas Eve, long after the festivities had ended and my family had retired to bed. I'd always loved the serenity of this time, the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflecting on the freshly fallen snow. That night, the quiet seemed heavier, almost oppressive, but I dismissed it as my imagination. I sat by the fire, sipping cocoa, when a faint tapping came from the window. I lived in the middle of the forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. Startled, I approached the window, expecting to find a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, I saw a faint handprint on the frosted glass. The prints were small, like those of a child. My heart pounded, but I rationalized it as some sort of prank. Still, I double-checked all the locks and returned to the living room, trying to shake the unease. The clock chimed midnight, and the atmosphere grew colder. The fire that had been roaring minutes earlier now flickered weakly. Suddenly, I heard faint jingling bells, followed by soft whispers. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room. They were incoherent, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. I stood frozen, trying to pinpoint the source, when I noticed something at the foot of the staircase. A figure cloaked in shadows stood there, motionless. It wore a tattered Santa suit, its face obscured in darkness, but its eyes glowed a chilling red. It raised a bony finger and pointed towards the Christmas tree. I followed its gaze and watched in horror as the ornaments began to spin, faster and faster, until they shattered one by one. The figure began to ascend the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. Terrified, I locked myself in my bedroom and hid under the bed. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a deep, guttural laugh. Suddenly, the air grew icy, and I felt a cold breath against my ear. A raspy voice whispered, "Leave before dawn." I didn't wait to find out what would happen if I stayed. As soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, I grabbed my keys and fled. When I returned after Christmas, the house felt different, darker, emptier. I never spent another Christmas there, and to this day, I can't look at a Santa suit without feeling a shiver down my spine. The farmhouse had been in my family for generations, and after my grandparents passed, it became mine. It was a quaint, secluded place, perfect for a peaceful Christmas. While decorating, I discovered a dusty box labeled Christmas 1924. Inside were old ornaments, faded photographs, and a leather-bound diary belonging to a girl named Evelyn. The diary entries were cheerful at first, describing festive celebrations and snowy mornings. But the final entry, dated Christmas Eve, was different. Evelyn wrote about a stranger who had knocked on their door during a storm. Her family had offered him shelter, but by morning, they were all dead, their bodies frozen in twisted positions. The stranger was never found. As I read, a knock echoed through the house. I froze, staring at the door. When I opened it, no one was there, but the snow on the porch was disturbed, as if someone had been pacing. The atmosphere grew colder, and I heard faint weeping coming from the living room. There, by the tree, sat a ghostly figure of a young girl. Her eyes were sunken, her dress tattered. She pointed to the diary and whispered, "He's coming back." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Panicked, I fled, leaving everything behind. To this day, the farmhouse remains abandoned, and the legend of the stranger lives on. Image prompt: a ghostly girl with sunken eyes sits by a Christmas tree, pointing toward an old diary. The room is dim, with faint shadows of a looming figure in the background. My aunt gifted me an antique mirror for Christmas, claiming it had been in the family for generations. It was beautifully ornate, but gave off an unsettling vibe. Every time I looked into it, I felt as though something was watching me from the other side. On Christmas Eve, I noticed my reflection didn't match my movements. While I stood still, it turned its head and smiled. Panicked, I covered the mirror with a blanket, but that night, I heard scratching coming from beneath it. I uncovered the mirror, and my reflection stared back, grinning maniacally. It reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. "Let me in," it whispered. I smashed the mirror in desperation, but instead of shards, it oozed a thick black liquid. The liquid spread across the floor, forming into a shadowy figure. It lunged at me, and everything went black. When I woke up, the mirror was whole again, hanging on the wall, and my reflection was gone. It was a treacherously cold Christmas Eve, and I was driving home after a long day of work. The snowstorm had turned the roads into a perilous maze, and I was the only car on the desolate stretch of highway. My headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, and the radio crackled with static, adding to the eerie silence. Then, out of nowhere, I saw them. A group of carolers stood by the side of the road, huddled together and singing. Their voices carried an unearthly harmony, even through the howl of the wind. They were dressed in Victorian-era clothing, their faces pale and serene. For a moment, I thought they might be part of a holiday event, but as I slowed down, I realized something was off. Their eyes were empty, hollow, as if devoid of life. I rolled down my window, the cold air biting my skin. "Do you need help?" I asked. Their singing stopped abruptly, and they turned to face me in unison. A young woman stepped forward, her lips curling into a faint smile. "We're waiting for you," she said. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively hit the gas. My car skidded on the icy road, but I managed to regain control. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, the carolers were standing in the middle of the road, their mouths moving in silent song. Their eyes glowed faintly, following my car as it sped away. The further I drove, the louder their singing became, as if it were coming from inside the car. My heart raced as I turned a corner, only to find them standing in the road ahead. I swerved to avoid them and crashed into a snowbank. Dazed, I looked around, but they were gone. The only sound was the howling wind. Morning came, and a passing motorist found me and called for help. I told myself it was the stress and exhaustion playing tricks on me, but every Christmas Eve since, I've heard faint singing outside my window, no matter where I am. I've always loved Christmas morning, the excitement of unwrapping gifts and the joy of the season. But last year, Christmas morning brought me something I'll never forget. Among the neatly wrapped presents under the tree, there was one I didn't recognize. The paper was crimson, tied with a black ribbon, and the tag simply read, "For you." I assumed it was from a friend or neighbor and decided to open it. Inside was a small porcelain doll, its face painted with a sinister grin and its hands stained red. It was exquisitely detailed, but something about it made me uneasy. I set it aside and continued with the day, trying to forget about it. By evening, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, the tree ornaments swayed as if touched by an invisible hand, and the house grew unnaturally cold. I noticed the doll had moved from the shelf where I placed it. Its position was slightly different, its head tilted as if watching me. That night, I woke to the sound of faint laughter. I bolted upright and saw the doll sitting on my chest, its cold porcelain hands resting against my skin. Its lifeless eyes seemed to bore into mine, and its grin appeared wider than before. I threw it across the room, but it landed upright, its head snapping towards me. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the house. "You'll never be alone again," it whispered. I screamed, running to the fireplace to throw it into the flames. The fire roared unnaturally high, engulfing the doll. For a moment, the house fell silent, but as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint, chilling laugh. The doll's shadow danced on the wall, even though it was gone. I moved out of that house, but every Christmas morning, a red gift appears under my tree, no matter where I am.